Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 101 Criminal Law Online. And tonight we are going to be discussing Chapter 8. Now, this is going to be one of the shorter chapters, so you don't have to hear me talk as long, so that's always a great thing. But we're going to be talking about offenses against the public peace and mostly about things like disturbing the peace and riots and routs and failure to disperse and all those different types of phrases that I'm sure you already know what they are because you were diligent and you've already read through chapter 8, so you already know exactly what I'm going to talk about. But before we get started, just another quick reminder about the student review resources that are at the end of each chapter to help you with the definitions and what have you. So again, a great resource for you to use to help you study for all of your quizzes and your chapter exams as well. So with that being said, let's jump right into chapter 8. And as we're getting ready to go here, and before we start, I would suggest, and I think I posted this in the weekly module for this particular section, but if I didn't, look up on YouTube The Anatomy of a Riot. And it's a 3 to 4 part series. And yes, it's a couple hours long, all of it when you put it all together. But it walks you through the LA riots and shows you how neighborhoods started to kind of fall apart and some of the things that the law enforcement agencies at that time didn't do right. And then we later learned from, of course. But again, while it's a 3 to 4 part series, it really does go through how things really start to bubble over. And just by the title, Anatomy of a Riot. And they do a lot of interviews with people that were there, the officers that were involved, and they talk about a lot of different factors. So a great sequence of videos and some really good information on how to deal with a lot of these different public offenses that we're going to be talking about. And the reason I bring that up is because more and more, as you watch the news and things like that, you see more of people demonstrating, and not just maybe related to law enforcement type things, but at all different types of functions. And it really is incumbent that law enforcement knows exactly what they need to do when it comes to these types of issues that they're going to be dealing with. So with that being said, let's kind of jump right into chapter 8. We're talking about offenses against the public peace, and we'll start off with section Penal Code 415 that really talks about disturbing the peace and what is it. But at common law, any willful and unjustifiable disturbance of the public peace was a crime. Now, the offense consisted of disturbing a neighborhood or number of people assembled in a public meeting, or of disturbing an individual in such a manner or to such an extent as to provoke a breach of the peace. In California, offenses against the public peace are defined in several different code sections, and they cover fighting and unreasonable noise, and disturbances of various public meetings and damaging property, rioting, trespass, terrorism, and disturbance on school campuses and on college campuses, to name a few. But for us to kind of get rolling on this, let's talk about disturbing the peace and what it is, and then that'll just give us kind of a better idea as we start to move forward. So Penal Code 415 says disturbing the peace is unlawfully fighting in a public place or challenging another person in a public place to fight. It's also maliciously and willfully disturbing another by loud and unreasonable noise. And we'll talk in a few seconds about, what is that? What's loud and what's unreasonable? Is it you listening to your favorite rock and roll band at 3 o'clock in the morning, or is it some guy that's running an auto repair shop out of his garage and he's grinding metal at 4 in the morning? I mean, so there's all these different things that are there. And the last part would be using offensive words in a public place, which are inherently likely to provoke an immediate violent reaction. And kind of think about these as we start to talk about it, because what type of noise again is unreasonable? Who cares if two people are fighting in a public place? And are there words that are really so offensive that people are going to nut up? And the answer to the last one is yes, there could be. And the answer to the loud and unreasonable noise, sure, there are things that are very disturbing. And the answer to the first one is, well, yeah, I mean, you shouldn't be out there fighting in a public place. It's a danger to others. And then who knows how things are going to escalate based on something that might just start as a simple fist fight or whatever. So this is the definition of disturbing the peace. Now, they have subsections, and there's a lot of subsections in this chapter, and I'm not going to go through all of them. We might list some, and we'll take a look at a couple, but I'm going to need you to probably go through and take a look at some of the other ones. Now, when they talk about that fighting or challenging to fight, this is the part of 415 and Penal Code 415.5 that applies to persons who fight or challenge another to fight. It may be difficult to apply this portion of the statute in cases not observed by the officer, because sometimes you're not there when this stuff happens. At times, both participants in a fight will be guilty if they are mutually involved. They kind of call it mutual combat. And on other occasions, one may be a victim of an assault and battery. So when you get to these types of calls, you have to kind of be able to sort through them and figure out exactly, what's happening. Now, the loud and unreasonable noise. Well, in determining what constitutes loud and unreasonable noise, the officer must really first determine if it can be considered some type of communication. Now, communication is words, shouting, or cheering that is intended to convey ideas and is generally, not always, but generally protected by the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech, etc. Now, on the other hand, a noise such as a loud motorcycle engine revving at 3 o'clock in the morning is not a communication, and neither is shouting that's done for the purpose of disruption. A loud family fight or quarrel during the night would also fit into the disturbance category. So if the noise is not a communication and based on time, place, or manner in which it was made is the kind of noise that would disturb a reasonable person, an arrest would be justified if someone was in fact disturbed by it. Now, the call that you'll probably get the most or a lot of in the middle of the night will be those cool barking dog calls, where the neighbor is tired of hearing the dog barking next door, and you'll have to determine whether or not your city has some type of city ordinance against barking animals, or make a determination on whether this is something that would be malicious and willfully disturbing another by loud or unreasonable noise. Well, okay, and then the last part here, just to kind of get things going here, what about like this offensive words? And how does that play into this? Well, the United States Supreme Court recognizes the existence of what we call fighting words, which are applicable to Penal Code Section 415, subsection 3. And these are defined as those words which, by their very utterance or speaking, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. The utterance of fighting words is not protected by the First Amendment guarantee of free speech, and later cases support the view that it is not merely the words themselves, but also the context in which they are uttered or said that qualify them as fighting words. And there is often a further requirement that words be spoken with the intent to have an effect inciting the hearer to an immediate breach of the peace. Now, there's a lot of things that you could kind of throw into this, and we're not going to spend too much time on it. But if you look in your textbook on page 124, there's a couple of cases that have interpreted what kind of language qualifies as inherently likely to provoke. And there's the John V case where the words F and bitch, and sorry, I'm not going to say it all the way out, but I think you get what I mean, screamed by the defendant at his neighbor as she drove by, were in fact found to be a violation of the statute. However, in People versus Callahan, the characterization of F an asshole directed at a police officer by a hostile motorist at an accident scene was held insufficient because the officer was neither offended by the language nor provoked to react. Now, there are some words that you can probably think of, and I'm not going to go there, but there are some words that you could probably say to some people that might provoke them into having that immediate violent reaction. And I think that we probably all know that. And an example of some other things that you can't really utter, and we talk about free speech, but I'm just going to kind of throw this in there, would be doing something really not smart, like being at an airport and talking about explosives or bombs or hijackers or things like that. So while we have free speech, we can't just yell fire in a crowded theater and expect that to be okay. So hopefully that kind of clears that up there. Well, what about like things like signs or shirts or stuff like that? Do we have the right to have things like that? And while we're going to cover a couple other sections in a minute, I wanted to kind of go over this. So there's a case out there called Cohen versus California. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court held that the California statute on disturbing the peace was not violated where a defendant walked through a courthouse corridor wearing a jacket bearing the words F the draft. Now, the court here reasoned that no person who viewed the jacket could regard the words as a direct personal insult, and there was no showing that anyone in fact was violently aroused, therefore there was no violation. But what about something like a KKK shirt being worn at some demonstration? Do you think that would be enough to possibly incite individuals to be extremely upset? And the answer would probably be yes. So again, that's why you have to really read and look through these sections and understand what people's rights are when it comes to things like this, or what rights they don't have, like I was talking about, yelling fire in a crowded theater and things like that. Now, there's other things that fall under the disturbing the peace section, like interesting, a couple of them we'll talk about quickly. Vehicle Code Section 27007 that talks about sound amplification. You know, you ever pull up next to the person in a car and their windows are thumping so hard they're rattling and it's causing your windows in your car to thump, and then as three other cars pull up they're all thumping because this guy's stereo is so loud? Well, realistically, so there is a section for things like this: sound amplification device emitting from a vehicle in excess of 50 feet or more. And then there are things like obscene or harassing phone calls, or annoying 911 calls, or criminal threats, or things like that. And criminal threats can actually be filed as a felony. So these are just a couple of different sections that you can kind of look at that fall under the disturbing the peace section, but we've already kind of gone over those bigger areas. Now, more towards unlawful assemblies and routs and riots and things like that, and how do we differentiate all of those different sections, because even the penal code sections are pretty close number-wise, which is okay, and some of these actually almost even seem the same. Now they're not, but let's make sure that we look closely at them. But first, let's start with unlawful assembly. So Penal Code 407 is the definition of unlawful assembly. whenever two or more persons assemble together to do an unlawful act or do a lawful act in a violent, boisterous, or what they call tumultuous manner. And remember, I told you when we talk about law, a lot of times they'll define what unlawful act is or what violent or boisterous or tumultuous means, and we'll look at that in just a second. This is classified as a misdemeanor, and assembling for a lawful act can also be a crime if done so in a violent, boisterous, and tumultuous manner. Now, you can assemble, you have the right of assembly, you just can't do it in violation of this particular section. So what does it mean, though, to assemble and to do an unlawful act? Well, the statutory language that there must be an assembling to do an unlawful act only requires that there be an assembly for an unlawful purpose by those who knowingly participate. Those in the assembly must intend to commit an unlawful act or engage in an unlawful purpose. Now, furthermore, when we talk about violent, boisterous, or tumultuous, in a prosecution for violation of this part of the statute, the courts have said that not every meeting where violent or boisterous conduct occurs may be called an unlawful assembly. The statute is intended to prevent a tumultuous disturbance, a big one, turmoil, which is kind of where that word tumultuous comes from. Disturbance from the public peace by two or more persons having no legal or constitutional objective to assemble and act in such a manner which produces danger to the public peace and tranquility, and which excites terror, alarm, or consternation in the neighborhood. So how about those that are unlawfully assembling, or they're assembling together because they're upset about an opinion, a law, an arrest, a verdict, or whatever it is, and they start becoming loud and boisterous, and they're doing this in a manner that starts to produce a danger to public peace, which means that they're running down the street, maybe throwing items or screaming profanity or standing in the roadway or things. And these are things that you have to kind of look at. And if you take my advice and you look at that anatomy of a riot, you'll start to see these things. You'll see what an unlawful assembly really is. You'll see what a riot is and what a rout is and what a failure to disperse means. So watch those and you'll get a better understanding. So just keep in mind the right of the people to assemble peaceably for lawful purposes is protected by both the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and Article 1, Section 3 of the California Constitution, unless, of course, an assembly is creating an imminent risk of property damage or personal injury. Law enforcement officers are usually advised to consult with their legal areas or superiors, supervisors, and get some type of legal counsel before declaring an assembly unlawful, because you really have to kind of read through all of this information. So that's, in a nutshell, unlawful assembly. Well, then, if it's an unlawful assembly, what does failing to disperse mean? Well, there are several statutes which provide police officers with adequate authority to suppress major disturbances, unlawful assemblies, routs, and riots. And we'll define all these in just a few minutes. The more common of these are the ones that we're going to kind of go over right now. So Penal Code Section 416A says if two or more persons assemble to disturb the peace or to do an unlawful act and do not disperse when commanded by a public officer, that would be the police, the person is guilty of a misdemeanor. Now you look at Penal Code Section 409, so you'll go through a little bit further here. Every person who remains at the place of any riot, rout, that's spelled incorrectly just so you know, or unlawful assembly, who remains at the scene after being told to disperse is guilty of a misdemeanor. So we have some enforcement sections. We have the failure to disperse section, and along with these come responsibilities of notifying the individuals that they have to leave, that they have to disperse. And there's a certain way that you have to say it. And hopefully we can get to that information as well. But if you watch those videos, you will actually see that. So here we have two sections, 416A and 409, that talk about the penalties, the fact that they're misdemeanors for failing to disperse when commanded by a public officer, and then someone that remains at the scene of a riot or a rout or an unlawful assembly, any of those, after they were told to leave. Now, a couple of other things that we have to kind of think about would be, well, what about like all that cleanup and stuff like that? And I might be getting a little ahead of myself, but that's okay. Well, there's a section that's on the books. It's 416B of the California Penal Code, and it talks about liability for damages and cleanup. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to get somebody on the hook for this and you're going to be able to get someone to do it, but this particular subdivision provides that any person, as a result of violating Penal Code Section 416A, and we already read that, those that fail to disperse is guilty of a misdemeanor. Those who personally cause damage to real or personal property, whether publicly or privately owned, shall make restitution, which means pay back for the damage caused, including but not limited to the cost of cleaning up, repairing, replacing, or restoring the property. Now, the burden of proof on this particular type of claim rests with the prosecuting agency or the claimant, but that's just something that kind of, again, is favorable to policing. Now, what about, so we've talked about 409, which is remaining at the scene of the crime, and we talked about 416, which is failing to disperse. But let's look at 409.5A. So this section gives law enforcement the authority to close any type of area relating to a disaster site. So if there's a fire, a flood, an earthquake, or something like that, we can close it to the general public. And Section C under that same area there, that same code, also gives us another bit of authority that says a person who willfully and knowingly enters this particular area that was closed off is in fact guilty of a misdemeanor. So we have the ability, of course, to close off that area, and then if you enter that area, you can in fact be arrested for a misdemeanor. The other section that I don't see here up there, and I wanted to make sure that I went over, would be Section D. So we looked at Section 409.5 and we looked at A and C. Well, I want to throw out D really quick before we get into route and riot. So Section D talks about nothing in this section shall prevent a duly authorized representative of any news service or newspaper or radio or television station or network from entering the areas closed pursuant to this section. Now, there's always been a rub between, let's say, the media, the live media, if you will, and law enforcement, because law enforcement's job is to make sure that we secure the scene and nobody gets hurt, and we secure evidence and things like that. And on the other hand, the media, their job is to report on big stories or any type of stories and inform the public and things like that. And there's a word for this. I mean, even though there's a rub, the police do need the media, and the media certainly need the police, and they call this a symbiotic relationship, meaning that they need each other. Now, they might have a little bit of different agendas, but at the end of the day, the media need the police for information and things like that, and the police might need the media to help locate missing children or suspects or things like that. So we really do need each other. So we always have some problems as it relates to the press at the scene of a large type disaster. Now, that doesn't mean that the press can enter one of your crime scenes and stand around and drink coffee and drop food wrappers and things like that. Now, they're not entitled to enter into a crime scene. You can bring them in if you want. You can secure a little area for them to all be in, which is typically what we do, so they can get a good camera shot at what they're doing. So we really try to work with the media, but the media do have access to those areas that the general public may not have access to, as it relates to, again, Section D that talks about disasters and things like that. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody kind of understood that part. So now let's move into a couple of other sections. We've already talked about unlawful assembly, and we've talked about disturbing the peace and things like that. Well, let's look at what a rout is and what a riot is. Now, and we talked about failure to disperse, so we've got a couple of those under our belt. So now Penal Code 406 defines a rout. So 2 or more persons. So some of these are going to sound kind of familiar, but they are different. 2 or more persons assembled and acting together make any attempt or advance toward the commission of an act which in fact would be a riot, and we'll see riot right down before that. So a rout you can kind of describe as it's not an attempt, but it's the preparatory stage of a riot. So it's the groups, the 2 or more persons that are assembled together, that are advancing towards the commission of some type of act, that if they carried that act out, it would in fact be a riot, and it is a misdemeanor. And then the next one right below it, 404A, and we're talking about Penal Code Section 404 subsection A, talks about what a riot is. So remember, we've got the rout, which is the preparatory stage to what we're going to talk about right now. So a riot is any use of force or violence. So we could probably stop there, go back up to rout, and see that if people were advancing with bottles and rocks and sticks and banging on cars and moving towards a building or something like that, could you see how that could be described as getting ready as a preparatory stage to assert some type of force or violence or disturbing the peace or threat? Is it making sense? And I think it probably is. So any use of force or violence disturbing the peace, okay, so that one, or any threat to use such force or violence if accompanied by immediate power of execution is guilty of a riot. Now the chief element, okay, in riot is the use of force or violence, or the threat to use force or violence to disturb the public peace. So hopefully that kind of makes sense to everybody. So again, a rout may be described as that preparatory stage for a riot, as it's an attempt or an advance towards the commission of that act that, if carried out, would have been a riot. And then the riot itself would be any use of force or violence disturbing the peace, or threat to use such force or violence if accompanied by immediate power of execution by 2 or more persons acting together without authority of law, and that definitely would be a riot. So now that we kind of know what they are, let's talk about a particular, usually it's a person, it could even be a group of people, but there's a section out there, and there's always that person. If you were to watch that Anatomy of a Riot or Anatomy, that's right, Anatomy of a Riot video in that 4-part series, you would start to be able to pick out somebody that is inciting. And inciting means to like provoke and get everybody excited and amped up. And causing people to maybe carry out the actual riot itself. So there's a section in the code there that helps us out that talks about inciting a riot, or the section actually says urging a riot, and it's Penal Code Section 404.6. So every person who with the intent, because you need to have the intent to cause a riot, does an act or engages in conduct which urges a riot. Standing on the top of a car with a baseball bat, beating on the car, yelling and screaming whatever profanities or get 'em or whatever it is, whatever phrase is out there. Can you picture that in your mind, how that act might engage people in conduct which urges them to get all upset? Throwing rocks through a store window while screaming whatever it is that they're screaming. Do you think that could incite the crowd of other people to start that frenzy of throwing rocks, and then the first person that actually goes into the store that starts taking all the stuff out, which is actually looting, which occurs during a riot? So hopefully that picture kind of comes to mind as we talk about these things. So does an act or engages in conduct which urges a riot. Next, urges another to commit acts of force or violence, burning or destroying of property at a time and place, and under circumstances which produce a clear and present and immediate danger of acts of force or violence, or the burning or destroying of property. Now, this is a misdemeanor, but it also must be shown, again, that the suspect's acts or conduct was with specific intent to cause a riot. And that's why law enforcement typically will videotape a lot of things, and we will even use news footage that is shot at the scene of riots to help us, if they're willing to give it to us, identify those involved in these types of activities. So hopefully, again, talking about that, you kind of get that mental picture of where I'm going with that. Now, sometimes during these riots, you'll see people that are taken into custody, and you'll also see the crowd maybe try to possibly pull that person back, meaning like rescue that person that may have already been arrested. And this does really happen, not often, but I mean it does happen. So there's a section for that. So Penal Code 4550 is the section for what they call prisoner rescue, and I don't think rescue is the right section, but anyway, the taking by means of a riot, and we already know what a riot is, right? Of any person from the lawful custody of any police officer is the crime of prisoner rescue. Any person who participates in the crime of prisoner rescue is punishable by imprisonment in the state prison. Now, one of the possibilities, and I'm just going to throw this out there for food for thought, there was an old phrase out there, and it was titled lynching. And this type of section fell underneath that section, but that particular word in itself could mean some different things, some very inappropriate things, and therefore I believe that the name of that was actually changed to what you see now, which would be prisoner rescue. So same information, just a different title. And again, when you look in your textbook, because I know you were all super diligent and you've already read ahead, you'll see a lot of other disturbing public meetings and religious meetings and hate crime statutes that are out there, because these go within that offenses against the public peace section. So I'm not going to go through every single one of those, and they're on page 129, I believe, in your textbook, but there are separate sections for disturbing of a meeting, certain meetings, or political meetings, or religious meetings, or sporting events, you know, the guy that runs out on the field streaking or whatever, vandalism in a cemetery, or just plain old hate crimes, which is 422.6, or access to clinics or religious facilities. So there are different sections out there that we can kind of look at. And one of the other sections that tends to come to mind that has quite a few subsections, and we're not going to go all those, would be trespassing. And this is a section that you get, sometimes it's intertwined with unlawful assembly because people are in certain areas that they're not supposed to be. And also it's a crime in itself, just trespassing. And you'll see some of the other sections as we start to look at section 602 and what have you. But trespassing law in California is made up of about 20 plus subsections of law. The general laws of trespassing are found in 602, so section 602. That's the general section. And this section is comprised, again, of about 20 specific subsections, each with its own elements, which must be proven to be enforceable. And those subsections, rarely used by law enforcement, aren't listed in your textbook, but the ones that are typically used are there. Now, 602.5, Penal Code section 602.5 deals with entering or remaining in a non-commercial dwelling, house, apartment without the consent of the owner. And this particular section may be used when a person has entered somebody else's home but has not met the elements of burglary, like theft or other felony. You could use this section for a very interesting case that was very tragic that I can remember. Let's start off with something basic. Let's say that a couple of people go out and they have a little bit too much alcohol, and the one person, one is driving and one drops the really intoxicated person off maybe on the corner. And I think that this is my house, but it's really not my house because I am severely intoxicated and I enter that home. Have I really entered with the intent to commit a theft or another felony? The answer would probably be no, probably because I'm intoxicated, and this call has actually happened. And so we could arrest for trespassing on something like that, or maybe your thought is just to get in a place to stay, to shelter or something like that. And you're just in a place where you're not supposed to be, but your intent isn't to commit theft or any other type of felony. So again, there's a lot of different subsections. Now, the tragedy of one particular case happened, and you could probably Google it if you wanted to find it in the news, but again, we're talking about very interesting law as we look at some of these things, was when an individual was so intoxicated they left a party. They went to a home that wasn't theirs, not sure what they were thinking. They tried to force their way into a home that was actually occupied by an individual who had a disabled child and wife, and this person thought that somebody was coming in to do them harm, and a shooting occurred and somebody was killed, the person that was trying to force their way into the home. So you can see how these things can escalate into different types of criminal activity. From what I recall, the person that did the shooting was not found liable based on the statements that he gave and the witness statements and the fact that he was protecting his property, etc. But that just kind of came to mind, and I wanted to really throw that out. But all of those 602 sections are on page 130, and you can go through them all. And again, some of them might sound funny to you, but typically we use the 602 or the 602.5, the basic trespass sections. And so next would be things like forcible entry and detainer. Forcible entry and detainer is found under Penal Code section 418, and destruction of property is found under 603. Now, these are similar to those described in trespassing, except they involve the additional element of forcible entry or damage to property inside. So I'm not going to, again, go through each one of these. We really don't deal with them quite a bit. But when you talk about Penal Code section 418, I'll give you a little bit more. Every person using or procuring, encouraging or assisting another to use any force or violence in entering upon or detaining any lands or other possessions of another, except in cases in the manner allowed by law, is guilty of a misdemeanor. And then you have the next one, which is destruction of property. Also in your textbook on page 132 and 133, you'll see some sections that are school disturbance laws. And there's quite a few of them. So we're not going to go through them all, but you can look at them here, and you can see there are crimes against the public and school officials, disturbing the campus peace, obstructing students or teachers on access to classes. I mean, you can just kind of go all the way down the list here. Entry on campus after being suspended, non-students on campus, etc. So I just wanted you to take a look at all these other sections that are listed under the school disturbance laws. And then finally, we're going to finish up with disorderly conduct. And this is another one of those where there are actually quite a few sections when we look under disorderly conduct. And the basics, or the base section, can be defined under Penal Code 647. And this one says, every person who commits any of the following acts shall be guilty of disorderly conduct, a misdemeanor. So unlike trespassing, which deals with a similar criminal principle, disorderly conduct is kind of a smorgasbord of different crimes. And again, there's a lot of them. And most arrests are likely to be made under the statute's varied subsections than other sections in the penal code. Disorderly conduct generally includes most kinds of unruly type behavior or disturbing behavior, or those that provoke some type of disturbance. So let's see if it's got the list of them all. Yeah, so here's some of the frequently used subsections, and you can kind of look down the list here. So soliciting or engaging in lewd conduct in public, or engaging in prostitution, or lodging in a building or structure or vehicle without the owner's consent, prowling, meaning loitering around on private property without the lawful business, or peeking into somebody's window on private property, or looking through a peephole. So you can see these are all those weird type sections that are, that are disorderly conduct. Now, the one that you'll probably run across the most in law enforcement would be subsection F. So I'll take a minute to talk about that one a little bit more, because here we're dealing with public intoxication. So section F talks about someone who is found in any public place under the influence of intoxicating liquor, any drug, controlled substance, toluene. And if you don't know what that is, you get that from like sniffing paint or glue, or things like that, or any combination of any intoxicating liquor, drug, controlled substance, or toluene, in such condition that he or she is unable to exercise care for his or her own safety or the safety of others, or by reason of this, his or her being under the influence of intoxicating liquor, drug, controlled substance, or any combination of intoxicating liquor, drug, toluene, interferes with or obstructs or prevents the free use of any street, sidewalk, or other public way. So that's a very broad section, and you could probably see how law enforcement would probably use that in a lot of different aspects. Now, when we talk about public security and safety, there are just a ton of different sections there, and those also fall under offenses against the public peace. And I'm not going to go through every single one of those. I'm going to let you go through these. So on page 130, it starts on page 135 and goes to 137. It lists all of those 647 sections. And then as you move into a little further into on page 138, it starts going through all of these different sections here. It defines what a public nuisance is. And there's sections for smoking in public buildings and on playgrounds, and participating in a street gang, and dangerous animals and things. And some of these sections have come up for a reason, like damage to jails or prisons, where people willfully and intentionally basically write on the jail wall or destroy a jail or a prison or public property or things like that. So you can see why some of these sections are necessary, but again, it's another one of those smorgasbords where everything is kind of there. And you look at the last one, the paparazzi section, which is restrictions on the paparazzi, where it makes it a misdemeanor to harass the children of those famous parents, if you will. So again, just a lot of interesting information to kind of look at, and we're going to end with a couple of quick slides here talking about street gang participation, because this will be something that you'll run across prevalently and you'll use. So, known as the Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act, Penal Code Section 186.22. The elements include any person who actively participates in any criminal street gang with knowledge that members engage in a pattern of criminal activity, who promote, further assist members engage in felonious criminal conduct by members of the gang, are in fact guilty of a felony. And then finally, terrorism, section 11413. Any person who explodes, ignites, or attempts to any destructive device or explosive, or who commits arson in or about places listed in the statute, and there's a list of those in the statute here, for the purpose of terrorizing another, is guilty of a felony. So that pretty much wraps up Chapter 8. Again, don't forget those good resources that are there for you at the end of each chapter, especially the matching definition exercise that they have, and that'll certainly help you when it comes to the quizzes and to the exam. So if you have any questions on Chapter 8, feel free to post them on the general discussion board, or if you need to, send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So with that being said, that'll be all for now. Bye.